Europe is lagging behind, as we've seen in several previous videos. It's no longer just that the southern European nations are doing badly, it's that giants like France and Germany are heading in the same direction. Until today, there was one group that denied that this was happening. According to them, Europe had simply opted for a different social model than other countries that are faring better, such as the United States. It must be that having all the tech giants in your country and salaries twice as high as the European ones is not preferable to having eco-sustainable bike lanes or having leading universities studying degrowth. Of course, those argued these things are going well were mainly politicians and bureaucrats. But look how complicated the matter has become, that even they have realized that the path the continent is traveling on must change.
We have said many times that growth has been slowing down for a long time in Europe, but we've ignored it. Until 2 years ago, we would never have such a conversation as the one we're having today.
The man you are looking at on the screen is Mario Draghi. Some of you may be familiar with him because he was the president of Italy before Giorgia Meloni, but most of you will know him from his legendary speech as president of the European Central Bank when the 2008 crisis broke out.
The ECB is ready to do whatever it takes to preserve the euro.
Whether Mario Draghi saved Europe or condemned it to stagnation by uttering these words is still being debated today. But we aren't here to talk about the past, but rather about the future. A few days ago, the former president of the European Central Bank delivered a report that highlighted all of Europe's economic problems. But, and this is the most important thing, it's also loaded with solutions. The Draghi report proposes a new model for Europe, a model with which to return to being on the same level as the United States itself. And many of you may be thinking, well, the European Commission and all these bodies are forever coming out with reports and things like that. But let me tell you something, this report is completely different. Most documents of this type are pages and pages written in political jargon, in a language that consists of filling a lot of space while saying absolutely nothing. In other words, the same thing kids do with their high school history exams. Fill in pages and pages to see if the teacher will soften up a bit. However, Visualeconomik community, Draghi has done the opposite. Come on, you can't get more direct than this.
Across different metrics, a wide gap in GDP has opened up between the EU and the US, driven mainly by a more pronounced slowdown in productivity growth in Europe. Europe's households have paid the price in foregone living standards.
So the questions are clear. What is Draghi proposing to revitalize the European economy? Will this serve as the new roadmap for Europe? And perhaps the most important question, could it really work? Today on Visualeconomik, we tell you all about it. Draghi's report begins by making Europe's problem very clear: lack of productivity. Yes, Europeans work less than Americans. Regardless of whether you consider that a positive or a negative, at least that loss of wealth comes with something in return. What happens is that productivity is different, and it's precisely this lack of productivity that explains 70% of the GDP per capita gap. And we aren't talking about a minor gap. To give you an idea, Hawaii, which is the poorest state in the US, has the same GDP per capita in purchasing power parity as Germany, and almost 50% more than Spain. And the main reason for this gap is the lack of investment. But take note, it's not a lack of government investment. In fact, European countries invest exactly the same percentage of GDP in R&D as the US. The culprit is private investment, which is much, much lower. To give you an idea, even Communist Party China has a higher proportion of the private sector in investment than the Europeans, both in terms of GDP and in terms of total investment. In essence, European companies don't invest. And since they don't invest, they don't grow. And because they don't grow, there is no European Google. To make matters worse, for 20 years, almost all the companies investing the most money in Europe belonged to the automobile sector. And yet the big players in the transition to the electric car are the American company Tesla and the Chinese BYD. Even in their best sector, they are no longer strong. They are being overtaken on both sides. So who is responsible for all these failures? Draghi is clear.
The problem is not that Europe lacks ideas or ambition, but innovation is blocked at the next stage. We are failing to translate innovation into commercialization, and innovative companies that want to scale up in Europe are hindered at every stage by inconsistent and restrictive regulations.
In particular, and as we talked about in our video on Europe's backwardness in artificial intelligence, there is hardly any venture capital in the old continent. That is, there are very few investor groups that put their money into small companies to make them grow. These groups are essential because, unlike banks, they specialize in selecting the fastest growing companies and can therefore take higher but more profitable profitable risks than banks. The problem is that in Europe, there are so many financial regulations, and taxes are so high that venture capital invests 80% less than in the US. As a result, the savings of Europeans are therefore left gathering dust in a fixed rate account in the village bank instead of financing budding companies. To give some figures, in the United States, bank assets are something like 100% of GDP, and historically they have been just over 50%. How high would you say the figure is in Europe? 150? 200%? Well, no, we're talking about 400%. All the money is in the good old bank. And if we add to this the fact that almost none of the world's top universities are in Europe, and that the best researchers almost all end up working in the USA with a salary 10 times higher, it becomes clear why innovation is so lacking. The few remaining investors are encountering laws such as the General Data Protection Regulation, which has caused online traffic to drop 15%, and the number of apps in the Play Store to fall by 26%. In fact, a funny anecdote about the European regulation is that, if you remember, not so long ago, when you searched for something on Google, you could immediately open Google Maps. But now you have to open several tabs to access the Google Maps service. This is not happening because Alphabet engineers now want to hide maps. It's happening because European regulations consider that integrating the search engine and maps is unfair competition. I know it sounds absurd, but this is the way Europe is regulated, and what is hidden from the public is much worse. In any case, enough talking about problems. Today, we've come to talk about solutions. The solution for Draghi is clear. Investment and more investment. An R&D boom of 5% of GDP. That's roughly 800 billion euros in just 5 years. To make a comparison that is repeated a lot in the report, the Marshall Plan barely implied an increase in investment of 2% at most, less than half the amount proposed now. How to achieve it? Draghi plans to cut and simplify many regulations, lower taxes on venture capital, and ramp up spending on training. In this, there are two key aspects. The first is for adults to continue their education with programs of all kinds. In other words, no more finishing your degree in your early 20s and never opening a book again in your life. And the second key is to create programs to encourage talent retention in Europe based on excellence. Draghi wants engineers to stay in Europe. Nevertheless, the former president of the ECB knows perfectly well that this won't be enough to achieve the 5% target. So he calls on the European states to invest government money as never before. How will it be financed? Well, we'll talk about that later, but for now, you can take it as read that the most repeated recommendation in the whole report by far is to centralize the competencies of the member states into a single central body for the whole of Europe. For what reason? The idea is to copy the USA, where almost all public spending on science is decided by the federal government and not by each state. Thus, they say spending would be much more efficient, less dependent on local lobby groups, and subsidies would also be concentrated in the most critical fields for Europe. Although it must be said, if the investments are to be decided by the politicians in Brussels, everything will end up going to the creation of biodegradable phosphorus bicycle lanes. But jokes aside, one priority seems to be to make investments more risky. For this, once again, it's been thought to copy organizations such as DARPA, which was behind inventions such as the internet and GPS. And take note, all this doesn't mean that more regulation is going to happen. The idea is to eliminate national regulations in order to impose a single European regulation, which in theory will be less oppressive than the current status quo. Because yes, when we talk about European bureaucracy, it's not just one union that must be taken into account, as individual countries have their own. In any case, let's not imagine that Europe is suddenly going to have the labor market of the USA.
However, a laissez-faire approach is also unlikely to succeed in Europe, given the threat it could pose to employment, productivity, and economic security.
Draghi makes it clear the European social model is non-negotiable. But leaving this aside, there are two other major issues facing Europe, and the two are very, very closely related: the energy transition and the trade war with the US and China. We talked earlier about how regulation and taxes are holding back investment in Europe, but there is another big reason: the very high price of energy. Europe has always had a much higher price for electricity than the US, but after the outbreak of war in Ukraine, the cost has skyrocketed. These days, it has recovered quite a bit. It's still very high, and there's always the fear that there's going to be another massive price hike. And you know, with $1 million on the line, everyone's a coward. And yes, the European politicians are also to blame here when they decided to shoot themselves in the foot, shut down nuclear power plants, stop fracking, and replace it all with Russian gas. Perhaps the only positive thing was that Europe bet on renewables, but it did it so rapidly that they ended up being a government money black hole. And well, let's not even get started talking about biofuels. But as if that wasn't enough, they saw the price of electricity completely skyrocketing and said, you know what's missing? Taxes.
For the four largest EIIs, chemicals, basic metals, non-metallic minerals, and paper, decarbonization is projected to cost 500 billion euros overall over the next 15 years, while for the hardest to abate parts of the transport sector, maritime and aviation, investment needs stand at around 100 billion euros each year from 2031 to 2050.
However, although it may seem otherwise, for Draghi this isn't a bad policy, but rather an opportunity. What's more, despite admitting that green policies are one of Europe's three major challenges, due to their much higher targets than those of the US or China, his solution is not to go backwards, but quite the opposite. Europe should step on the accelerator of the energy transition. Basically, the idea is to turn this problem into an opportunity. Take advantage of the fact that CO2 is practically a luxury good to encourage investment in renewables that are cheaper than gas and coal. For this, there is a clear call to explore all possible alternatives. Well, not all of them. Fracking is not mentioned, but at least it's absolutely clear about nuclear power. Closing operating plants is suicide. Draghi calls for further exploration of this energy through new modular reactors, for instance. Of course, he also proposes creating new European bodies to direct subsidies to clean technologies without having to go through the filter of each member state. But hold on a minute, didn't Draghi say that we had to deregulate? Well, no, not entirely. The opposite is true for energy. There's a lot of talk in this section about regulation, especially around the financial products derived from gas and their role in determining the price of the energy mix in the marginalist model. Why is there a call for regulations in this area? The section of the report basically blames the malfunctioning of the system on a secret monopoly of companies that speculate with these prices. What can I say? Don't ask an Italian to be a Javier Milei. And speaking of Milei, what about taxes? Yes, Draghi does talk about lowering them, but it doesn't seem that the tax on CO2 is one of them, even though it has reached 110 euros per ton, while in California it was around 30 and only 5 in China. Oh, and while we're on the subject of China, let's talk about Europe's other major concern, geopolitics. Europeans have experienced firsthand what it means to depend on a dictatorship for something as important as energy, but our dependence on other countries such as China for crucial materials is even greater. That's why Draghi is clear. Mining must return to Europe. Yes, social, sustainable, eco-friendly, and even vegan mining, but mining nonetheless. According to him, Europe should create a monopsony, which is something like a monopoly, but of buyers instead of sellers. The idea is exactly the same. If all the EU nations join forces, they will be stronger for negotiating the price of raw materials. It would be like an OPEC, but in reverse. Of course, if this were done by someone in the private sector, he or she would go straight to jail. But that's good old politics for you. Be that as it may, having cheap energy and rare earths is of no use if you don't have an industry capable of converting them into competitive products. Think about cars. Will Europe really become competitive again by simply lowering the price of electricity and lithium? Probably not. The damage has already been done, and now the other countries are way ahead. So what's the solution? Well, alternatives can be explored. To begin with, the report acknowledges that there are sectors where Europe is so far behind that it's not even worth trying to re-engage unless they are strategic. And what is a strategic sector? Do you know? Because I don't, and apparently neither does Draghi. His report almost seems to say that anything goes as a strategic sector.
Anything can be regarded as strategic material, even a button. A soldier will not wear pants without buttons, since otherwise he would have to hold them up with his hands, and then what can he do with his weapon?
However, there are other sectors where Europe is lagging behind, but in this case there's still time to get back on track with an appropriate boost. An example? Again, automobiles. How could this sector be given a boost? Well, the answer surely won't surprise you, with a European-style Inflation Reduction Act. In other words, more subsidies for European cars and more tariffs for Chinese and American cars. With this, the report makes its opinion very clear. Europe has fallen behind in the automotive sector due to a lack of planning, and the solution is an industrial New Deal. The idea, of course, is that this is only a temporary policy, and that in a few years the industry will have modernized so much that it will be able to compete on a level playing field without aid. But of course, that remains to be seen. The question is, who is footing the bill for all this? Well, Visualeconomik viewers, what can I tell you? That's what we'd like to know. On the one hand, Draghi plans to ramp up public spending to unprecedented levels. But on the other hand, he seems to be making it quite clear that the deficit can't skyrocket either. So then, public spending will have to be lowered, right? Well, do you remember what we told you about Europe promoting innovation with the sole criterion of excellence in mind? Well, it comes with two major nuances. The first is that excellence should be inclusive, benefit everyone, and not aggravate existing inequalities. But in the last last paragraph of the summary, they recognize that the fact that the most excellent people have huge salaries is a very American thing and does not fit within the European social model, so that income tax should be lowered for the middle and lower classes. Or, put another way, raise taxes on the rich. Yes, on those who go to work in the US because they earn more and who are precisely the ones you want to retain. Draghi, my friend, you'll have to do black magic to reach your goals. At the moment, it seems he has 3 secret weapons in store. Number 1, issue a lot of debt. Not individual member countries, but rather of the entire European Union. And so German and Swedish taxpayers will serve as collateral for less responsible countries such as Italy or Spain. Come on, a second next generation. Number 2, the Laffer curve. Yes, the one that suggests that by lowering taxes, you can increase revenue, but with a twist. The idea is that, yes, okay, Europe is going to go into debt in order to invest, but those investments will make us more productive in the long run. And with that extra productivity, we can generate wealth to pay for the investment without raising taxes. And number 3, well, the third is another old favorite, inflation. Draghi recognizes that his policy recommendations will generate more inflation, which is basically a tax that goes towards paying the government debt while impoverishing the rest of the citizens. Will the plan work? Well, it remains to be seen, but while the press has celebrated it as the Great Awakening of Europe, what can I say? It looks like the same old formulas, a whole lot of talk and few solutions. To begin with, it seems that Draghi wants Europe to be the USA, but without being the USA. That is, to have a competitive private sector, but instead of having a very flexible labor market, to make it work with subsidies. What's more, it's a completely different path to becoming rich than the one followed by the USA, but also the one being followed by the most successful countries in Europe, such as Poland. And the worst part, that the report still doesn't take sides in very important debates. For example, let's go back to the previous case. Do you want more students in engineering? Yes, but hey, let's not have any of that talk about eliminating subsidies to careers such as journalism in order to relocate resources. Do you want cheap energy? Yes, but the main tax, which is the CO2 tax, it can't be touched. And so it goes with everything. In our view, Mario Draghi invents an ideal world that does not and will not exist. The fact that he's betting on a kind of United States of Europe with the strengthening of the single market, and above all, with the elimination of national bodies to create European agencies, is a clear case in point. Because apart from whether Brussels bureaucrats could make this better or worse, how is something like this going to be implemented when there's a severe rise of Eurosceptic parties across the continent? And it's not even just the Eurosceptic parties anymore. A few days after this report was presented, there was a European vote to strengthen the common market. The result? Overturned by the opposing opinion of France, Italy, and Spain. Why? Because centralizing food trucks would mean taking food trucks away from the member countries. In short, the Draghi report is very good at assessing Europe's problems, but it's not clear that the solutions it proposes are the best ones, and it certainly doesn't seem that the rest of Europe's politicians are very willing to go for them anyway. What do you think of the report? Do you think it provides good solutions to European problems? Will it become a roadmap? Or will it be filed in a drawer and forgotten by all politicians? Well, it's time for you to leave me your answer in the comments below. As always, don't forget that here on Visualeconomik, we release new videos every single week, so subscribe to this channel, hit that little bell so you don't miss any of our updates. If you like the video, go ahead and like it, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care, thanks for watching till the end, I'll see you next time.